Welcome to Kat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hello, hello. I'm your host, Kat, and this is Kat Has Questions. Okay, guys, I am super excited about this episode. So for the next few weeks, we're doing something a little different. Instead of one standalone mystery, we're diving into a 5-part story, a case that twists and turns and completely redefines what we think we know as it unfolds. So I've been researching this one and writing it for like a month now, and guys, let me tell you, it is crazy. I'm calling this arc Dead Wrong because this is a story about assumptions, about investigations that felt certain, and about a man who was convicted, about how everything we thought was true wasn't. This is the story of Pamela Hupp. And trust me, it only gets stranger from here. Let's get into it. Part 1 of Dead Wrong, The Last Ride. A woman leaves a Christmas party on December 27th, 2011. She gets into a car with a friend. She's dropped off at home, and a few hours later, she's dead. And before anyone knows what really happened, before evidence is sorted, before questions are asked, before doubt has time to form, the story of why it happened is already taking shape. At this point in the night, no one outside the house has any reason to believe this death will become complicated. There's no alert, no manhunt, no public warning, just a quiet home and a call that hasn't been made yet. Within the criminal justice system, this is what investigators call the pre-narrative phase, the brief window where facts exist, but meaning hasn't been assigned to them yet. And that window is smaller than people realize. So as I mentioned, December 27th, 2011. This happens in eastern Missouri, not rural in the way people imagine. It's not like farmland stretching forever, but it's really not urban either. Subdivisions, cul-de-sacs, church fundraisers, places where people know each other enough to feel familiar. And it's winter here. Cold that isn't dramatic, but it's persistent. Gray skies that press down instead of breaking open. The kind of weather where everything feels quieter than it should. This is a place built for routine. Evenings that repeat themselves, houses that look alike, streets where nothing ever seems to happen until it does. The space between Christmas and New Year's, that strange quiet week where time feels soft around the edges. We all know during that week between Christmas and New Year's, we don't even know what day it is. Betsy Faria attends a small gathering, a trivia night fundraiser for a church with friends and acquaintances. It's not a wild party, it's not dramatic. People eat, they talk, they play trivia, and they unwind. According to later statements from attendees, nothing about the evening stood out at the time. There were no reported arguments, no emotional confrontations, and no indication that Betsy was distressed or afraid during the gathering. There's no record of an argument. And this matters because in homicide investigation, witnesses often retroactively reinterpret earlier moments once they know how the night ends. Here, that reinterpretation doesn't exist, at least not yet. No scene, nothing that would later stand out as a warning. At some point in the evening, Betsy leaves the party with a friend, Pamela Hupp, who goes by Pam. Pam left this party earlier saying she didn't feel well, but that she would come pick her up when it was over. Pam is someone Betsy knows well. They have worked together, they've spent time together. In investigative timelines, familiarity is often treated as neutral, sometimes even reassuring. Proximity doesn't always automatically trigger suspicion. In fact, it often does the opposite. This ride home will later become a fixed point in the investigation. Not because anything unusual is reported, but because it is the last independently verifiable moment in Betsy Faria's timeline. Pam offers Betsy a ride home. The drive itself doesn't register as important at the time. No one reports, like I said, raised voices. There was no tension between the two. Pam pulls up to Betsy's house. Betsy gets out. She goes inside, and Pam drives away. This is the last confirmed moment anyone sees Betsy Faria alive, according to Pam. Investigators later rely heavily on this moment because it is one of the few points in the night that can be corroborated by more than one source. Everything that happens after this is reconstructed through inference. Within hours, this ride becomes less about what happened and more about what it allows investigators to anchor it to. When certainty is scarce, anchors matter. That fact won't feel heavy until later, And at the time, it's just a detail. Later that night, Betsy's husband, Russ Faria, comes home. Betsy and Russ's house sits like thousands of others in Missouri suburbs. No gate, no fence, no sign that anything inside is worth protecting. These are homes built for safety, or at least that's the illusion. Garages that open automatically, front doors you lock out of habit, not fear. Places where violence is something you watch on television, not necessarily something you plan for. According to police summaries, Russ has been out earlier in the evening and returned home hours after Betsy was last seen entering the house. His movements that night are well documented through interviews, corroborated by receipts and statements gathered in the early days of the investigation. Russ, that evening, while Betsy was at the party, he was at a friend's home in Missouri, watching movies and hanging out with multiple friends. This was a planned social gathering, not a spur-of-the-moment get-together. Multiple witnesses corroborated his story and were there for his alibi. He expects a normal end to a normal day. Lights, quiet, routine. He gets home and lets the dogs out. Instead, he finds something wrong almost immediately. What happens next is not disputed. Russ gets home and Russ calls 911. The call is logged as a medical emergency rather than a homicide report. Russ does not tell the dispatcher that his wife has been murdered. He reports that she won't wake up, that there is blood, and that something is wrong. At this point, the call exists as a real-time artifact. Unfiltered, uncoached, and made before Russ has any understanding of what investigators will later believe happened. The 911 call is later reviewed multiple times by investigators and prosecutors, not for factual inconsistencies, but for tone, affect, and emotional presentation. There was a lot of debate about how he sounded on the 911 call, which can be a difficult thing to assess what is quote-unquote normal. Like, how do you make a normal 911 call when you find your wife dead? But some felt it was over the top. In criminal investigations, 911 calls are often treated as baseline behavioral evidence, not because they establish what happened, but because they are believed to show how someone reacts when they think no one is watching. The assumption is that the truth leaks out under the stress. But stress doesn't produce uniform behavior. So you don't know how you're going to act if you're calling 911. Some people are really calm. Some people are freaking out. I think both ways are valid. So in the 911 call, in the transcript, the operator answers and says, "What's your emergency?" And Russ says, "I just got home from a friend's house and my wife killed herself. She's on the floor." They asked if she's breathing and he says, "No, she's not breathing. She's on the floor." And they keep kind of asking questions just like to get more information. They ask if she's conscious and he says, "No, she's not." They also ask if he sees any weapons and he says there's a knife. There's a knife sticking out of her neck. And then basically the operators tell him just like not to touch anything, not to touch the knife. And he was kind of just going in and out of hysteria. He sounds panicked. He sounds scared. He sounds all over the place. And you can also hear him saying that he thinks she committed suicide. So his brain is just grasping for straws of like what could have possibly happened in their home. Russ doesn't call 911 saying his wife has been murdered. He calls because she won't wake up, because there's blood, because something is wrong and he doesn't know what to do. His voice isn't steady. He isn't explaining a story, really. He's just reacting in real time to what he's seeing. Answering questions, repeating himself, trying to follow instructions as the moment keeps slipping further out of reach. Somewhere in the middle of the call, the tone changes, not into panic, but into understanding, that the kind that arrives too late. And when the call ends, he's still asking for help. Investigators later note that the call does not contain a clear narrative, a theory, or an explanation, only reaction. At this stage of an investigation, officers typically separate reaction for reconstruction. Problems arise when reaction is treated as a reconstruction too early, though. First responders arrived at the home, police entered, and Betsy Faria is dead. She has been stabbed 55 times, and the knife was left in her neck. So kind of exactly what happened in the breakdown of when he came home, so beat by beat. As I mentioned, it's December 27th in 2011. Russ returns to their house. He stopped at Arby's before heading home. And when he walked into the house, he entered their living room area, and he found his wife, Betsy, lying on the floor in front of the sofa. Her body was covered in blood, and she had been stabbed a lot of times, like I just mentioned. The scene reportedly had blood on the carpet beneath her head, and she was already cold and stiff by the time he had arrived, indicating she had been dead for some time before he called or before he arrived. According to police record, Russ arrived home at 9:40. He called immediately, crying hysterically and initially saying he thought Betsy had committed suicide, which responders quickly determined was not possible just given the nature of her injuries. First responders arrived 9 minutes later. She was found on the living room floor in front of the couch, not like in the bedroom or bathroom. Forensic evidence later suggested that Betsy was killed well before Russ came home, so likely around 7:20 p.m., and Russ came home around 9:40, or at least that's what he told them when he came home. So this is the moment the scene formally shifts from a medical emergency to a homicide investigation. Control of the environment changes. Movement is restricted. Observation becomes documentation. Russ told police that his wife had spoken of suicide in the past, so he jumped to a conclusion when he saw her body. He said that he left their home at 5:30 p.m. that day, made a couple of purchases, and then drove a half hour away. When he came home, like I said, he stopped at Arby's. He had receipts for this and was seen on surveillance video, and then drove the 25 miles to their home where he discovered her body and called police. These statements are recorded in early reports and later referenced repeatedly. Not because they are unusual, but because they establish a timeline that can be checked out. Receipts, surveillance footage, witness confirmations. At this point, the timeline is verifiable. The autopsy did later confirm that there were multiple sharp force injuries. The number is stated once in official summaries and becomes the defining detail of how this crime is characterized. There are no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows appear intact. No immediate evidence suggests an intruder entered the home with force. The absence of forced entry doesn't answer a question, but it kind of narrows them. It limits the numbers of explanations investigators are willing to entertain this early. And once they are narrowed, attention shifts from discovery to confirmation. The house becomes a crime scene. Bright lights, movement, voices layered over one another. Neighbors gather and watch from the streets, and questions start forming. And even before the questions are written down, some of them quietly stop being asked. And almost immediately, the investigation moves in a very familiar direction. When police arrive at a scene like this, there are patterns they're trained to recognize. A violent death inside the home, no forced entry, a spouse who found her. It's not lazy, it's honestly statistical. Intimate partner violence is real. It's common, and it's often the right place to look first. Investigators later described the early hours of the case as focused on establishing whether the scene supported a domestic homicide rather than an unknown assailant. And as we talked about, there was no forced entry, so they're kind of leaning that direction because that's where they believe the evidence is pointing. Russ Faria is questioned. He cooperates. He's interviewed that night and again in the days to follow. His statements are compared against developing timelines. These interviews are documented in initial police reports and supplemental follow-ups. They are not conducted as interrogations at this point. They are information-gathering conversations meant to establish consistency and opportunity. His emotional responses are observed closely. How he speaks, how he reacts, how grief presents itself in real time. As we kind of talked about, some people cry, some people shut down, some people don't react the way anyone expects them to. In homicide cases, emotional presentation often becomes an informal data point. Not because it proves anything, but because investigators are trained to notice deviation. The problem is that deviation has no fixed baseline. In true crime, we talk a lot about behavior, but behavior is not evidence, it's interpretation. Here, the story begins forming quickly. The lack of forced entry reinforces the domestic theory. The violence reinforces emotional escalation. And Russ presents at the scene, combined with his grief, becomes something to interpret rather than something to contextualize. This is the moment where investigators quietly shift. Not from open to closed, but from curious to directional. So as investigators are trying to reconstruct this timeline, they start collecting context. Who was Betsy? What was her marriage like? Had there been problems? And Pamela Hupp becomes a large part of that picture very early. She's present, she's emotional, she offers insight into Betsy's state of mind. Pam tells investigators that Betsy was afraid, that Russ would practice putting a pillowcase over her face, and that Betsy would confide in her, that she was planning to leave her husband. These statements are documented in early investigative summaries and later referenced repeatedly as contextual support for motive. So, investigative terms, these are witness-provided context, not like corroborated fact. They're not supported by text or emails, anything that could be found written down. But they are preserved in reports because they help explain a theory that was already in the works. And these statements are taken very seriously. Pam is not treated as a suspect. She's treated as a witness, someone close enough to fill in emotional gaps that evidence can't reach. At this stage, the investigators do not challenge Pam's account. There is no adversarial questioning, and even some of the investigators are very friendly toward her, more so than they should be. There's no verification attempt, no effort to independently confirm whether these fears were shared with anyone else in Russ's circle or Betsy's circle. It's not necessarily unusual, but it is consequential. Because one statement like this enters the case file and it doesn't sit idle. It begins to shape how everything is read. And slowly, the shape of the story becomes clearer. A troubled marriage, a private argument, a moment that escalated. The timeline is adjusted to support this interpretation. The violence is framed as emotional rather than tactical. And the lack of forced entry is explained rather than interrogated. Importantly, this story does not emerge from physical evidence. It emerges from narrative alignment, from how well the pieces seem to fit once they arrange in a certain way. It's a story people recognize, and recognition is powerful because it allows investigators, prosecutors, and eventually jurors to stop asking questions that don't fit the pattern they want to see. What mattered wasn't whether this was the only explanation, it was the one that felt right. So, over time, the focus narrows. The narrative centers on Russ Faria, not because there's definite physical evidence tying him to the crime, but because the story works. By this point in the investigation, alternative theories receive less scrutiny. This theory explains the violence. It explains the intimacy of the scene. It gives jurors something they've heard before. And once that story sets, it's hard to change that. Within a year, the state of Missouri arrests Russ Faria for the murder of his wife. They believe they have their man. They are confident enough to take the case to trial. And at that moment, with one arrest, one clear narrative, and one convincing witness, Pam, this case is considered solved and straightforward. But is it? Luckily for you guys, I'm releasing part 2 today as well, so you don't have to wait a whole week to get more. Next time, part 2 of Dead Wrong, The Best Friend. Sources for this episode are listed in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Kat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.